March 23, 1945. The air over the Rhine Valley is heavy with the acrid metallic tang of spent artillery shells and the sweet, sickening scent of smoldering pine. In the gray light of a dying afternoon, a group of 12 German nurses stands huddled together near a shattered farmhouse. Their starch-white aprons are now mapped with the dark stains of a long retreat, dried blood, axle grease, and the soot of the fatherland's final, desperate hours. 4 years, they had been the steady hands of the Wehrmacht's medical corps, moving westward as the front collapsed behind them. Now, there is nowhere left to run. The horizon to the west is no longer a line of German defense, but a churning wall of olive-drab steel. Emerging from the sulphurous mist, the first American Shermans crest the rise, their long barrels swaying like the necks of prehistoric beasts. The nurses watch with wide, hollow eyes, their breaths coming in shallow hitches. They had been told for months of the Amos, portrayed in propaganda as a disorganized, mongrel force of gangsters and soft, decadent city-dwellers who would crumble under the disciplined steel of the Aryan will. But as the column grinds closer, the sheer physical scale of the arrival defies their indoctrination. The tanks are followed by endless rows of GMC deuce-and-a-half trucks, each one laden with more supplies than an entire German division could hope to see in a month. The soldiers sitting atop the crates do not look like the starving, desperate men the nurses had treated in the bunkers of the Siegfried Line. These Americans are tall, well-fed, and strangely casual, their movements possessed of a relaxed confidence that feels more terrifying than overt aggression. A young nurse named Elsa clutches her medical bag, her knuckles white against the leather. She expects the shouting to begin, the harsh commands of a conquering army, the immediate stripping of their meager possessions. Instead, a lone American officer dismounts from a mud-flecked jeep. He does not draw a Luger or bark a threat. He simply adjusts his helmet, looks at the exhausted women, and gestures toward the rear of the column with a gloved hand. The silence that follows is broken only by the idling of engines and the distant, haunting sound of metal clattering against metal, the unmistakable chime of brass instruments being shifted in the back of a specialized transport vehicle. This sound, sharp and bright against the dull roar of the war machine, serves as the first jarring note in a new, incomprehensible reality. To these women, who had known only the austerity of the total war decree, the presence of anything other than ammunition and bandages in a combat zone is a riddle they cannot yet solve. They begin to walk toward the west, not as defenders of a collapsing Reich, but as witnesses to a civilization that brought its music to the edge of the abyss. To understand the profound shock of these 12 women, one must look back to the years of 1943 and 1944, when the Third Reich began its slow, agonizing contraction. These nurses were not mere civilians. They were products of the Deutsches Rotes Kreuz, an organization that, by this stage of the war, was deeply integrated into the military hierarchy. Their indoctrination had been absolute. Since the declaration of total war by Joseph Goebbels in the Berlin Sportpalast, every German citizen had been conditioned to believe that the conflict was a struggle of existential survival between a disciplined, ascetic European culture and a chaotic, racially diluted American materialism. The state had stripped away every luxury, every comfort, and eventually, every necessity to feed the furnace of the Eastern and Western fronts. For these medical professionals, life had become a grim tally of shortages. They had learned to perform surgeries by candlelight and to dress wounds with paper bandages when the linen ran out. They had watched their own soldiers waste away on rations of ersatz bread and watery soup, while the Ministry of Public Enlightenment hammered home a singular message. The American enemy was a hollow giant, a nation of spoiled merchants who could not endure the hardships of a real war. This historical backdrop created a psychological armor that was as rigid as it was brittle. The nurses were prepared for the worst of humanity, for the vengeance of the Red Army in the east or the calculated coldness of the British in the north, but they were entirely unprepared for the reality of American logistical superiority. In the German worldview of 1945, the war was a zero-sum game of suffering. To lose was to be obliterated. To win was to endure the most. Therefore, when they stepped across the threshold of the Rhine and into the custody of the U.S. First Army, they carried with them a heavy expectation of cruelty. They anticipated the same starvation they had seen inflicted upon others. They expected the same lack of resources that had defined their lives since the bombings of Hamburg and Dresden. This moment in history matters because it represents the first contact between a society defined by force scarcity and one defined by unprecedented, industrial-scale surplus. The nurses were moving toward a revelation that would destroy their ideological foundation more effectively than any bombardment. They were about to discover that the Americans did not just possess more guns and more planes. They possessed a culture that treated abundance as a fundamental right, even in the heart of a wasteland. The decadence they had been taught to despise was, in fact, an expression of a productivity so vast it could afford to be merciful, and an energy so buoyant it could afford to be loud. As they marched deeper into the American rear, the psychological weight of their training began to collide with the visible evidence of a different world, a world where the clatter of brass instruments signified a power they could not hope to match. The nurses were loaded into the back of a transport truck, its bed lined with thick, waterproof canvas that smelled of factory-new rubber and heavy-duty wax, a scent of industrial freshness that had long since vanished from the German logistics chain. As the vehicle lurched forward, joining a massive multi-lane artery of movement heading west, the women peered through the rear flap. What they saw was a caravan of plenty that defied every lecture they had received on the supposed material exhaustion of the Western Allies. On the roadsides, stacked 10 feet high and stretching for miles, were wooden crates stamped with USA in bold, black stencils. There were mountains of tires, pyramids of fuel drums, and endless rows of field rations. The emotional contrast was staggering. In the hospitals of the Ruhr, these nurses had been forced to boil and reuse bandages until they were gray and frayed. Here, they watched American soldiers use pristine white paper to wipe grease from their hands before tossing it into the mud. They had seen German surgeons operate without anesthesia, yet every passing American ambulance seemed to be equipped with a surplus of life-saving supplies that the Reich had not seen since 1940. This was not a military that was struggling to sustain itself. It was an organization that moved with the weight of an entire continent's industrial output behind it. To the nurses, who had been taught that the German soldier was the pinnacle of human endurance because he could suffer the most, the sight of Americans leaning casually against heaps of luxury goods was deeply unsettling. The fear of the Amos began to shift into a profound, hollow confusion. If the enemy was as weak and decadent as the propaganda claimed, how could they possess such terrifying, effortless volume? Every mile traveled further into the American rear was a lesson in the reality of the war. They passed field kitchens where the aroma of real beef and roasting coffee drifted through the cold air, scents that triggered a physical ache in women who had lived on sawdust-filled bread and vegetable peel soup. The Americans did not look like conquerors fueled by hatred. They looked like workers in a vast, efficient factory that happened to be located on a battlefield. This journey was the first fracture in their ideological armor. They had expected to find a theater of war as scorched and desperate as the one they left behind. Instead, they found a conveyor belt of steel and silk. The sheer casualness with which the Americans handled their abundance, the way a driver might toss a half-eaten chocolate bar or a nearly full pack of cigarettes, represented a level of wealth that was fundamentally incomprehensible to the German mind. In the Reich, every scrap of metal was a treasure. Here, metal was a common language of utility and leisure. Among the gear in the trucks, they noticed more of those strange, elongated cases that did not hold rifles. The mysterious chime of brass instruments continued to follow them, a recurring metallic echo that seemed to mock the silent, somber discipline of their fallen world. They were being pulled into the heart of a giant that was not only stronger than they were told, but one that seemed to be winning the war without breaking a sweat. During a brief stop at a roadside collection point, The nurses were permitted to dismount and stretch their aching limbs under the watchful eyes of military police. It was here, in the churned mud of a French field, that Elsa spotted it, a discarded, dented trumpet lying partially submerged in a puddle. It was a strange, alien object in a landscape otherwise dominated by the jagged geometry of war. In the German army, music was a formal, state-sanctioned affair, strictly regulated and used as a tool for martial discipline or somber Wagnerian propaganda. A musical instrument was a precious piece of cultural equipment, never to be treated with such casual indifference. Yet here sat this piece of brass, abandoned in the dirt like a spent shell casing. Elsa stared at the object, its golden bell reflecting the cold, overcast sky. It represented a fundamental shift in her understanding of value. In the Reich, the scarcity of metal had reached such desperate levels that church bells were being melted down for shell jackets and iron fences were being stripped to forge bayonets. The idea that a military force could possess enough surplus to simply lose or discard a complex brass instrument was a staggering blow to her logic. This trumpet was not a weapon, yet it spoke of a power more intimidating than a Tiger tank. It was the sound of a society that had not been forced to choose between art and ammunition, but had instead found a way to industrialize both. As she watched, an American soldier walked past, kicked the trumpet out of his path with a mud-caked boot, and continued his conversation without a second glance. To him, the instrument was perhaps just a broken piece of junk from a special services truck, easily replaced by the vast manufacturing machine back home. To Elsa and her companions, it was a symbol of a terrifying, limitless vitality. It was the sound of metal reimagined, no longer the shriek of shrapnel or the clang of a factory press, but a silent, golden testament to a world where even the tools of joy were mass-produced and expendable. The recurring metallic chime they had heard in the trucks finally found its visual anchor in that puddle. The nurses realized that the Americans were not just bringing soldiers and supplies across the Atlantic. They were bringing their entire culture, their noise, and their restless energy. They were bringing a version of life that refused to be silenced by the grim mechanics of total war. The dented trumpet remained in the mud as their truck roared back to life, a discarded relic of an abundance that was about to overwhelm them entirely. They were headed toward a camp where the silence of captivity would soon be shattered by the very sounds that instrument was meant to produce. The transport finally groaned to a halt at a massive, sprawling encampment established on the outskirts of a liberated French town. This was a prisoner processing center, a temporary city of canvas and concertina wire that seemed to have materialized overnight. As the nurses were ushered out of the trucks, the sheer logistical competence of the scene hit them like a physical blow. There was no chaos, no screaming, and no sign of the makeshift, desperate infrastructure they had managed in the East. Instead, there were organized rows of pyramidal tents, gravel-lined pathways to combat the mud, and the constant hum of portable generators providing a luxury they had forgotten: consistent electric light. The medical screening was brisk and professional. But it was the post-intake meal that truly began to unravel their composure. Each woman was handed a sturdy metal tray and moved through a line where American cooks, sleeves rolled up and faces flush with the heat of field stoves, ladled out portions that seemed impossibly large. There was white bread, not the heavy, sawdust-colored loaves of the Reich, but soft, bleached, and pillowy bread that looked like cake to their starved eyes. There were scoops of canned peaches in heavy syrup and thick, hot beef stew. However, it was the coffee that served as the primary instrument of shock. In Germany, coffee had become a bitter concoction of roasted acorns or chicory. The liquid being poured into their mugs now was dark, rich, and aromatic, topped with a slight shimmer of oil that spoke of its freshness and potency. As Elsa sat on a wooden bench, cradling the warm tin cup, she watched her companions. Some were weeping silently into their stew, others simply stared at the bread as if it were a trap. To receive such a bounty as a prisoner of war was a direct contradiction to the master race ideology they had lived by. If the inferior Americans could feed their captives better than the German High Command could feed its own frontline soldiers, then the entire moral and physical universe of the Third Reich was a lie. The sensory overload of the camp was a factual testament to the American way of war. While the German army moved by horse-drawn cart and lived off the land, the Americans moved by internal combustion and brought their entire standard of living with them. The nurses noticed the waste bins overflowing with empty tin cans and discarded wrappers, items that would have been recycled and rationed 10 times over in Berlin. This was arrival at the encampment, a transition from a world of desperate preservation to a world of casual, almost aggressive disposal. They were no longer just prisoners. They were students of a surplus they could not comprehend. In the distance, the mysterious sound of brass returned, no longer a chime from a moving truck, but a series of warm-up scales, sharp, soaring notes that cut through the low rumble of the generators, signaling that the evening would hold more than just a meal. As the sun dipped below the jagged horizon of the French countryside, casting long, bruised shadows across the rows of olive-drab tents, a peculiar activity began near the center of the stockade. The nurses, still processing the surreal indulgence of their evening meal, watched from the edge of their designated area. A group of men arrived, but they were not the grim-faced guards or the weary infantrymen they had grown accustomed to seeing. These men wore the same khaki uniforms, yet they moved with a different cadence, a light-footed, rhythmic grace that stood in contrast to the heavy, utilitarian trudge of the combat troops. They began unloading heavy, velvet-lined cases from a specialized truck, moving with a practiced coordination that hinted at a purpose far removed from the business of killing. The nurses huddled together, their whispers a mixture of suspicion and bewilderment. In the rigid hierarchy of the German military, every man at the front was a cog in the machine of destruction. The idea of a specialized unit dedicated solely to entertainment was an affront to their logic. They watched as a wooden platform was quickly assembled, a makeshift stage rising from the mud like an altar to an unknown god. Then came the instruments. The mysterious brass objects they had seen in transit were finally revealed in their full, polished glory. Saxophones, trumpets, and trombones caught the last rays of the sun, flashing with a brilliance that seemed almost obscene in a zone of occupation. There was no barbed wire between the stage and the audience of American soldiers who began to gather, nor were there the stiff, formal seating arrangements typical of a German military function. The GIs simply sat on the ground, leaning back against one another, lighting cigarettes with a casualness that suggested they were at a picnic rather than a theater of war. The nurses saw the band members adjusting reeds and oiling valves, the sound of metal now taking the form of soft, exploratory chirps and slides. To the German women, this was the setup for something they had been taught to view as a symptom of cultural rot. They were witnessing the arrival of a musical division, a force of men whose only weapon was their ability to harmonize. Elsa noted the lack of tension in the air. There was no barking of orders to stand at attention, no ideological preamble delivered by a political officer. There was only the low hum of anticipation and the sight of a band leader tapping his baton against a music stand. The nurses were confused by the lack of seriousness in the American ranks. They had been told that a nation that prioritizes jazz and swing is a nation that lacks the stomach for the hardships of history. Yet, as they looked at the thousands of well-equipped, relaxed soldiers waiting for the first note, they began to realize that this decadence was backed by a steel that the Reich could no longer muster. The stage was set, the brass was polished, and the silence of the evening was about to be shattered by a force more subversive than any artillery barrage. The bandleader's hand came down, and the silence of the French evening was obliterated by a sudden, jagged explosion of sound. It was not the rhythmic marching pulse of the German military bands, stiff, predictable, and heavy, but a soaring, syncopated roar of brass that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of the listener's bones. The music was fast, kinetic, and possessed of a strange, wild elasticity. This was the sound of the American swing era, transported across the Atlantic and unleashed in a theater of war. For the nurses standing at the edge of the wire, the initial sensation was one of pure, sensory shock. The trumpets screamed in high, defiant registers, their polished bells flashing under the electric work-lights of the camp. The trombones provided a deep, sliding growl that felt like the earth itself was laughing. To women whose auditory world had been limited to the scream of Stukas, the thud of flak, and the somber minor-key hymns of the Reich, this music was incomprehensible. It lacked the proper German gravity. It was irreverent, loud, and vibrantly alive. They watched as the American GIs began to move in their seats, tapping their boots and nodding their heads in a collective, unforced harmony. There was a sense of joy in the sound that felt like a direct assault on the ascetic discipline of their upbringing. Elsa felt a strange tightening in her chest. She had been taught that jazz was degenerate, a product of racial and cultural impurity that signaled the decline of the West. But as she watched the musicians, she saw something else, a level of technical mastery and individual expression that was breathtaking. The saxophonists leaned into their instruments, their bodies swaying with the melody, appearing less like soldiers and more like conduits for a restless, unstoppable energy. The recurring symbol of American power, the brass instrument, was no longer a discarded object in the mud. It was now a gleaming engine of morale, converting the industrial surplus of the United States into a tangible, emotional force. The music didn't just fill the air, it seemed to push back the darkness of the war itself. In the nurses' experience, a military gathering was a place of speeches and reminders of duty. Here, there were no words, only the overwhelming volume of the brass. The emotional contrast was at its peak. They realized that these Americans were not fighting because they were forced to buy a cult of personality or a fear of the secret police. They were fighting with the confidence of a people who could afford to bring their celebrations with them to the front. The sound of the swing band was the sound of a society that was winning not just through the quantity of its shells, but through the quality of its spirit. The nurses stood paralyzed, caught between the instinct to turn away and the undeniable, primal pull of the rhythm. The concert had only just begun, but the world they had known was already fading beneath the joyous, golden clamor of the brass. As the final notes of the brass crescendo hung in the humid night air, a profound and heavy silence did not follow. Instead, it was replaced by a shift in the internal landscape of the 12 women watching from behind the wire. This was the breaking point, the moment where the physical reality of the American abundance finally shattered the psychological glass of their indoctrination. For years, they had been told that Germany was the vanguard of civilization, a bastion of high culture standing against a tidal wave of American barbarism and material obsession. Yet, as the music faded, the nurses looked at their own hands, stained with the labor of a regime that had demanded everything and provided nothing but hardship. The transformation was not loud or violent. It was a quiet, devastating realization of loss. They began to understand that the war had not been lost on the day the Rhine was crossed, or even on the day the Sixth Army fell at Stalingrad. It had been lost because the society they served had built its foundation on the worship of scarcity and the machinery of death, while the Americans had built theirs on the industrialization of life and leisure. The music was the evidence. A nation that could afford to send its finest musicians to a muddy field in France, equipped with instruments that cost more than a German worker's annual salary, was a nation that possessed a surplus of spirit. Elsa felt the rigidity leave her shoulders. The fear of the Amos as monsters was gone, replaced by a hollow grief for the years she had spent believing in a lie. The decadence of the swing band was actually a manifestation of a freedom that allowed for joy even in the shadow of the sword. They realized that the discipline they had prided themselves on was merely a mask for a desperate, systemic poverty. The Americans weren't just better supplied, they were more humanly occupied. This ideological collapse was the most significant casualty of the evening. As the GIs began to disperse, laughing and sharing cigarettes, the nurses stood in the dark, recognizing for the first time that the world they had tried to protect was already a ghost, and the world that had captured them was the only one truly alive. The sound of the brass had not just entertained the troops, it had performed an autopsy on the Third Reich in the hearts of its most loyal daughters. The historical reality of the spring of 1945 was not just a victory of arms, but a victory of societal models. For the women held in the American encampments, the factual data they observed, the calorie counts of the rations, the logistics of the transport, and the frequency of the entertainment, formed a mosaic of truth that replaced the fiction of the Reich. Historical records of female detainees from this period frequently note a specific kind of surplus shock, a psychological state where the sheer availability of goods and the presence of morale-boosting units created a sense of unreality. It was a documented fact that the United States military, through the Special Services Division, operated hundreds of musical units near the front lines, a logistical feat that required more shipping tonnage than the entire German army possessed for its medical supplies. This abundance was the byproduct of a democratic system that, unlike the totalitarian model, did not view the individual as a mere fuel for the state, but as a contributor to a flourishing culture. The nurses were the primary witnesses to this discrepancy. They saw that the American abundance was not a sign of weakness or soft living, but the result of a freedom that empowered production. The data of the war, the millions of tons of steel, the billions of gallons of fuel, was finally humanized through the sound of a saxophone. It was the factual proof that a free people will always outproduce and outlast a people in chains. As they were eventually processed for repatriation, the nurses carried with them a silent understanding. They had been defeated by a nation that had the luxury to be loud. The final notes of the brass band have long since faded into the silence of history, yet their echo remains a profound testament to the nature of the conflict. The image of the German nurse, once a symbol of the Reich's austere and tragic resolve, standing transfixed by the syncopated rhythm of a swing band, represents the ultimate triumph of the American spirit. It was not enough to destroy the enemy's tanks. The victory required the destruction of the enemy's conviction that freedom was a flaw. That dented trumpet in the mud, that soaring trombone in the night, and the smell of real coffee in a prisoner's cup were the true heralds of a new era. They served as a reminder that the greatest strength of a democracy is its ability to maintain its humanity, its joy, and its abundance even in the darkest hours of human history. The war was won by the side that brought the music, proving that the sound of a free people, vibrant, unscripted, and loud, is the most powerful weapon ever devised. In the end, the nurses did not just survive the fall of their nation. They witnessed the birth of a world where the brass no longer signaled a march to the grave, but a dance toward a brighter, more abundant future.